All right, we've got quite the spread of Michel Foucault's work in front of us for this deep dive. Excerpts from Madness and Civilization, The Order of Things, lectures, interviews, even a snippet on Nietzsche. Who knew?
Foucault always did love a good challenge to the status quo.
That he did. And speaking of challenging the status quo, let's talk about this statement. Politics is the continuation of war by other means. Now, that's a bold claim. What do you make of that?
It's classic Foucault, getting right to the heart of how power operates. He wants us to see power dynamics at play everywhere, not just in government and laws, but woven into the very fabric of our relationships, institutions, even our ideas about what's considered normal.
So even when we think we're at peace, there's still this struggle for power bubbling beneath the surface.
Precisely. Foucault saw these power dynamics playing out everywhere, not just in government halls, but hospitals, prisons, schools.
Wow, everywhere.
Even our understanding of sanity and sexuality, he argued, are shaped by these often unseen forces.
So it's not just about who's officially in charge, but about how those dynamics, those power struggles play out in the everyday.
Exactly. And he wants us to look beyond the obvious, to examine the subtle ways these forces influence our lives. One of the best examples of this is his concept of the medical gaze, which he explores in Madness and Civilization.
Right, the medical gaze. I feel like I've heard that thrown around.
It's one of his most well-known concepts, for sure.
Okay, so refresh my memory. What exactly did he mean by the medical gaze?
He was talking about a shift from seeing madness as a spiritual experience to something medical, a disease to be treated. And with that shift, doctors gain a new kind of power.
Interesting.
The power to define what's normal and abnormal when it comes to mental states, to observe, classify, and ultimately control individuals labeled as mad.
It's like they become the arbiters of sanity with the authority to fix what they deem as broken.
Exactly. And the truly insightful part is that Foucault didn't see this as limited to medicine. He argued that this gaze, this power dynamic of observation and categorization, is at play in prisons, schools, even workplaces.
So anytime someone is being observed and judged, there's a potential power dynamic at work.
Absolutely. And this is where Foucault's work becomes particularly relevant today, wouldn't you say?
I was just thinking that.
We're constantly observed and categorized by surveillance cameras, algorithms, social media.
It's a bit unsettling when you think about it that way.
It is, but Foucault gives us the tools to recognize these dynamics and question them. And his work on biopolitics, particularly in The Birth of Biopolitics, takes this idea of subtle control even further.
Oh yeah, biopolitics. What was that all about again?
He argues that power isn't just about managing individuals, but entire populations.
So we've gone from controlling individual madmen to managing entire groups of people. How does that even work?
Think about it. Even something as well-intentioned as a public health campaign can be seen through a Foucauldian lens as a subtle form of biopower. It makes you question those for your own good messages, doesn't it?
Wow, I never thought about it like that.
Yeah.
But I can see what you mean. It's still a form of control, even if it's for our supposed well-being.
Exactly. Biopolitics uses public health, demographics, even statistics to manage populations. It's subtle but pervasive.
Yeah.
And it's everywhere in our modern world.
It's amazing how Foucault ties these ideas about power to how we even understand the world. Like it's not just about the structures of power, but how power actually shapes knowledge itself.
And that's where things get really interesting, right? Foucault really goes after that traditional view that knowledge is this, like, neutral thing, objective, just kind of out there waiting to be discovered.
Yeah.
He wants us to see that what we call truth, it's actually a product of those very power relations that we were just talking about, those struggles.
Yeah. You can definitely see that throughout these writings we have, like in this lecture on Nietzsche, he seems really skeptical of this idea of one capital T truth.
Oh, absolutely. He was totally against that. He believed that knowledge is constructed, not discovered.
Interesting.
It's always filtered through, different interests, perspectives, and, power dynamics.
So there's not one universal truth. It's just like different versions of reality depending on who has the power.
That's a great way to put it. Think about it like even how our understanding of mental illness, something we touched on earlier, has changed over time, right? What people once considered undeniable evidence of madness could be seen now as totally normal, maybe even a sign of creativity.
Oh, that's a perfect example. So what we believe to be true, like the human mind isn't fixed. It evolves as what's the word?
Yes.
Discourse. That's another key concept in Foucault's work, especially in The Order of Things, right?
Yeah. Oh, it's central to his whole theory. He uses discourse to describe how we talk about and produce knowledge, within a specific field. He's interested in those unspoken rules, the assumptions that are just baked in, the power dynamics that determine what it's even acceptable to say or think or even research. It's like
rules of the game.
Yeah.
Dictating what moves you can make and what'll get you in trouble.
Exactly. And those rules, Foucault argues, are never neutral. They reflect those power structures that underpin that whole field of knowledge. To really illustrate this, let's look at Foucault's analysis of the discourse around sexuality, especially in the history of sexuality. He points to that really dramatic shift in how, we categorize and control sexual behavior, particularly in the case of pederasty in ancient Greece.
Right. What was considered totally normal then later became taboo, even a crime.
And that shows perfectly how what we think of as natural or deviant is not fixed at all. It's fluid, shaped by these evolving social forces and ideas. It reminds us that even our current understanding of sexuality, it's not a given. It's a product of our specific historical and cultural forces.
Wow, it makes you question everything. And this all kind of ties into Foucault's critique of humanism, which I see mentioned in sources like Ethics, Subjectivity, and Truth. What's that all about?
So Foucault was really wary of that humanist idea that there's a universal human essence that we can uncover. He argued that even the concept of man is a historical construct, something quite recent, really, and deeply, deeply entangled with power.
You mean our definition of what it means to be human isn't this objective truth, but something that's been shaped and molded throughout history?
Exactly. He was concerned that this idea of man, this supposed universal, could even be used to justify new forms of power and control, It's a pretty stark warning against accepting any definition, even of ourselves, without really looking at it critically.
Yeah, that's mind-blowing and kind of scary when you really think about it. And to make sense of it all, Foucault came up with these really interesting methods of analyzing knowledge. Archaeology and genealogy, I saw you marked a passage in 2 lectures where he talks about this.
Yeah. Those are essential tools for anyone trying to understand. Foucault archaeology is kind of like, if you imagine digging through layers of discourse, excavating those hidden assumptions and power dynamics that we were just talking about, the things that shaped how we think.
So less about taking things at face value and more about understanding the foundation they're built on.
Exactly. It's like investigating the history of a building, right? You don't just look at the finished product. You check out the architectural plans, the materials they use, the social context.
Interesting.
That's archaeology. Now, genealogy takes a slightly different approach. It's about tracing the lineage of ideas over time, like you're building a family tree.
Okay, so less about digging down and more about tracing back.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
And what's so fascinating about 2 lectures, especially, is how Foucault connects those methods to his idea of, emancipating knowledge. He wants to break free from the dominance of any single discourse, even scientific discourse, to make room for alternative ways of knowing.
I like that.
He wants to uncover how power dynamics privilege certain forms of knowledge over others,
Okay, things are getting really deep here. But it makes you wonder, if knowledge is so bound up in power, if even our sense of self is shaped by these forces, is there any room left for, individual agency? Can we break free from these invisible structures, or are we, forever at their mercy?
Now, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's something Foucault grappled with a lot in his later work, especially when he started exploring the ancient Greek idea of care of the self.
Oh, yeah, care of the self. I remember that coming up.
Yeah, we see it in the History of Sexuality, Volume 3, also in the care of the self. He digs into these really fascinating practices of self-examination and self-discipline that the ancient Greeks were into.
It's interesting how he contrasts that with how we think about self-improvement now. Mm-hmm. It's not just about measuring up to some external standard, right?
Right. For them, it was about cultivating the self, ethically and intellectually. A lifelong project of, self-fashioning, if you will. And it wasn't just some, personal thing they were doing either. It was totally connected to how they navigated the power dynamics of their society.
So even back then, people were trying to figure out who they were in a world that's always trying to define them for them.
Exactly. And that struggle is just as relevant today as it was back then.
Yeah.
Think about it, right? How do we even make choices about who we are, what we believe, how we live our lives when we're constantly bombarded by media, advertising, just expectations,
It's a constant balancing act, trying to figure out what we want versus what everyone else wants from us.
Exactly. And Foucault's work, it gives us a new way to understand that whole process. It allows us to question those external forces and become aware of how they're shaping our thinking.
One thing that really struck me, especially reading the History of Sexuality, Volume 3, is how even our understanding of something as personal as sexuality that's been subject to these shifts in thought over time.
Absolutely. Foucault argues that those categories of normal and deviant, even when we're talking about sexuality, they're not fixed objective truths. They're actually historical constructs, products of particular power dynamics, not some kind of biological truth.
That example he gives about how the ancient Greeks viewed pederasty is wild, right?
Yeah.
What was once considered normal later became taboo, even criminalized. It shows how much our values are just products of our time.
Totally. And it drives home Foucault's point. What we see as natural is often just what we're used to. We inherit these beliefs and just assume they're universal. But he's encouraging us to dig deeper, to uncover the historical and social forces that actually shaped them.
So after all this deep dive into Foucault, where do we even go from here? What are we supposed to do with all of this?
That's the big question, right? Foucault's work, it isn't about giving us all the answers or telling us what to think. It's about giving us the tools to think critically, to question what we think we know, to never stop interrogating the world around us.
It's like becoming aware of how power works, how knowledge is made, even how our own identities are shaped by things outside of us.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the power of questioning, of challenging the status quo. Foucault's work reminds us that there are always other ways of seeing things, other sides to the story. And that searching for knowledge, it's an ongoing process of discovery and critique.
This has been a real eye-opener, and I gotta say, it's a lot to take in. So for our listeners who might be feeling the same way, what's the one thing you hope they walk away from this with?
If you only remember one thing from our deep dive today, let it be this. Never underestimate the power of asking why. Why do we believe what we believe? Whose interests are being served by a particular truth or narrative? Keep asking those questions, keep digging deeper, and you'll be amazed at what you uncover about yourself and the world.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the mind of Michel Foucault. If you're intrigued by anything you've heard today, and how could you not be, we encourage you to explore his work further. You might just surprise yourself with what you find.